places, or one of the foundational places to start is, you start with primary sources. So when we're looking back at the Vedas, we're looking back at the Upanishads, we're looking back at these foundational texts of yoga, it talks to us about our natural enlightened state of being. And that is really, really simple. It really is just the idea that we are beings in a human experience. And you can get fancy with it. You can call us divine beings in a human experience, or you can call us universal consciousness in a human experience. It's really whatever you feel comfortable with, but there's an essence to all of us that we all share. Are you able to get it, Lizzie?
I just received the email back, so now I finally have access. I will share my screen.
Cool. And once we understand that, once we have that idea of, that we are beings in a human experience, then we can sort of really branch out from there, and we can better understand not only who we are, but who and what everyone else is as well. And ultimately, that is where the wellspring of compassion comes from, that we're looking to access through our yoga practice. And so when we look at Tantra Yoga, and you can go ahead and click through to the second or the third slide for me, Lizzie. There we go, perfect. One back. So when we're looking at Tantra Yoga, we're really looking at a system of yoga. So it is a foundational system of yoga where we take multiple different aspects or multiple different schools of yoga and integrate them together so that the aspirant or the practitioner is able to achieve so the aspirant is able to achieve a state of being where they feel whole and complete, connected, and unified with Sat Chit Ananda, or pure universal truth, universal consciousness. So today we're just going to break it down. We're going to break down the principles of Tantra Yoga. In the workshop, we're going to identify the foundational principles of Tantra as a system of yoga intended to lead to illumination and absorption. And these principles include the history and philosophy of Tantra Yoga, what the human condition is, and the importance of an integrative practice, understanding our why are we practicing, and then understanding transcending and manifesting through self-realization. One of the things that I talk a lot about when I teach is, this is the way we teach and the way we talk about these things. A lot of teachers that have come before me, just in the lineage of yoga, they've taught from a very patriarchal position where enlightenment and self-realization is far away. It's hard to get to. And I don't believe that. I know that's not true. It's very accessible. It is part of our human condition. And in fact, that separation, the dichotomy of duality, is what leads us into the state of self-realization. It gives us access to it. Without duality, without polarity, it would be much, much more difficult for us to see our non-separate wholeness. We first have to see ourselves as separate before we can see ourselves as non-separate. And that's really what these practices do. They take us from this separation, this polarity, this duality, and they bring us into the truth of who we are in this wholeness. And so we'll move to the next slide, and we'll break it down and look at the different philosophies that come together. Tantra is an integrative system that weaves the many schools of yoga together to create a tapestry of integrative practices to support our life. Ultimately, the word Tantra means to loom, or to knit together, to weave. So we are taking many different practices and many different schools of philosophy and bringing them together. And the interesting part of Tantra Yoga is some of them actually sort of conflict a little bit sometimes. And the reason that that's okay is because everyone's personality is based on their lived experience. So when I am approaching my practice, I have to find practices and I have to find philosophies that meet me where I'm at in order to make it relevant to me. If I don't have that, then I'm not going to buy into it. It's going to be very hard for me to integrate it into my life. But if I have practices that meet me where I'm at, that meet me where my belief systems have led me, then I can begin to undo the doing a lot more easily. It's not as challenging. We'll move to the next slide, Lizzie. Thank you. So Tantra explores the duality or polarity that we experience as humans through the lens of different yogic philosophies and practices. These practices are influenced by Samkhya philosophy, which is a dualized philosophy, identifying Purusha and Prakriti as the essence of manifestation. So one of the things that, some of you that have studied with me or with the school, My Vinyasa Practice or MVP, you know that I teach from a non-dualized lens. Specifically, my specific lens is Kashmir Shaivism, but there are several different non-dualized lenses that you can look through. Advaita Vedanta is another one we're going to talk about today. That said, Samkhya philosophy really does influence a lot of the schools of Tantra Yoga, specifically Hatha Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, and we're going to look at those as we unpack the different schools that come together to create this tapestry that we can leverage. And one of the beauties of Samkhya philosophy is the marriage of Purusha and Prakriti. Purusha being that divine masculine, you might call it Shiva, and then Prakriti being the divine feminine, you might call it Shakti. And that's sort of how we can look at Purusha and Prakriti through the lens of Tantra. And we end up talking a lot about that, Shiva and Shakti, when we talk about Tantra Yoga. Those foundational principles really do play a big part in it. Next slide, yes. So this is something, one back, yeah. And this is something I wanted to touch on just because there is so much conversation about gender and sexuality and sensuality in Tantra, but it's a little bit misunderstood. And I think that part of the reason it's misunderstood is because sometimes as humans, and we're just really understanding gender versus sexuality in the last, 20 years or so, we get confused, it's a little confusing. These are very intimate aspects of the human experience. Some of you know this, and I am open about it, although I don't talk about it on social media very much, but my youngest child is transgender. And this idea of gender is an identity, right? Sexuality is something different. Sexuality is a different thing altogether, but gender is the dichotomy of I identify as female or I identify as male, right? And so this relationship between Shiva and Shakti, the feminine and the masculine, the divine feminine, the divine masculine, manifest through our lived experience, can be really beautiful and to connect to both parts of ourselves. What yoga tells us, and all of the schools of yoga tell us this, not just Tantra Yoga, but all of the schools tell us that we have both. We have that masculine aspect, we have that feminine aspect, we have a solar aspect, we have a lunar aspect. We have the aspect of doing and the aspect of non-doing, right? Rajas and tamas. So there are the aspects of the feminine and the masculine that come together. And I believe that this is really, where some of the misunderstanding, around Tantra Yoga originates, because in some of the ancient texts, it actually talks about bipolar and bisexuality when it comes to Tantra Yoga. And what they're talking about is the gender, the bigender relationship in our experience, not so much the sexuality as in my preference of who I want to couple with. It's more about the internal identity of the aspects of my being. The next one. So ultimately, if we're looking at this, there are 6 schools of Tantra Yoga. We have Hatha, Bhakti, Karma, Jnana, Rajas, and Laya. Most people are familiar with Hatha Yoga. Most people are familiar with Bhakti Yoga and Karma Yoga. Jnana, Rajas, and Laya Yoga are a little bit less familiar, although they're beginning to be more popular. We'll unpack each one of them over the next several slides. So Hatha Yoga is sometimes referred to as the yoga that represents the solar and lunar aspects of our experience. Hatha Yoga is also seen as a sort of a strengthening practice, and the opportunity for us to strengthen the physical, the intellectual, the emotional, and the spiritual body. The Hatha Pradipakita is one of the primary sources of Hatha Yoga that we can refer back to better understand the historical relevance of Hatha Yoga. We often hear that Hatha means union of solar and lunar, and there's definitely validity in that, but there's also other meanings of Hatha. So Hatha also means the effort that is required to strengthen, and it can also have other connotations as well. So Hatha implies union, and it's important for us to understand that even though all yoga implies union, there is definitely an element of duality in Hatha that is intentional and that is part of the practice. It's intrinsically part of the practice. Where in some other aspects of yoga, that duality is not as intrinsically part of the practice. So it sort of depends on the lens you're looking at the school through and the philosophy through. Next slide, Lizzie. Bhakti yoga is the yoga of devotion. Bhakti represents the creative expression of love and devotion of the divine. Bhakti is rich in poetry, painting, shloka, kirtan. The arts are a huge part of Bhakti. The poetry that comes out of Bhakti is just priceless. It's really amazing. And we most frequently see Bhakti yoga in the United States as an expression through kirtan and different satsang, right? So satsangas. We'll look at the next slide. Karma yoga is pretty interesting to me personally because it has different connotations depending on which lens you're looking at it through. If you're looking at it through Advaita Vedanta really looks at karma yoga as acts. So actually doing selfless service. So, and then Kashmir Shaivism looks at Kashmir Shaivism looks at karma yoga as sort of the non-doing, and I'll explain that a little bit more because this is actually part that I'm fascinated with. And one of my teachers is Richard Miller. I've studied almost 1,000 hours with Richard in various capacities between iRest and pranayama and different meditation courses. And Richard and I have talked about karma yoga through the lens of Kashmir Shaivism is basically doing your work, living a life that's projection free and coming clean. So you're not coming with your own agenda. You're not coming with your story. You're really coming clean and holding space for the other person. I'll give you an example that's a real life example. Let's say that, somebody in your household has a stomach ache. And they have a stomach ache and they're really sick and they don't feel well. And, you want to make them feel better. You really want to make them feel better. there's a couple ways you can go about holding space for that individual. You can ask them what they need, or you can tell them, well, you know, I take Pepto-Bismol when my stomach hurts. Well, there's nothing wrong with telling them that you take Pepto-Bismol when your stomach hurts. But from a karma yoga perspective, that is sort of projecting your experience onto them. And it's not that that's wrong. There's nothing wrong with that, but that wouldn't be looked at as a karma yoga sort of thing. Now, when we're looking at the first scenario of how can I serve you, that's karma yoga from a Kashmir Shaivism perspective. You're really coming without an agenda. You're like, I will do whatever you want. If you want me to just sit here with you and hold your hand, I'll sit here and hold your hand. If you want me to make you soup, I'll make you soup. Whatever I can do to serve you and whatever your perception of that service is, I'll give you. And so that's one way you can look at it. Now, there's another lens or another way we can look at karma yoga, and that's through the lens of selfless service or action. And that's the doing of things, and doing of things without looking for recognition, without getting a reward or an acknowledgement. And that's more of the Advaita Vedanta perspective of it. So it really is, they're very similar, but there are some differences between the two. If you were going to study karma yoga through the lens of Kashmir Shaivism, for example, the process and the practice is, to be silent for 3 years. There's a 3-year silent period where you really go inward and you just really reflect on everything that you would say and do. And so therefore you're not saying or doing anything. So it's a very intense process. Whereas karma yoga from an Advaita Vedanta perspective is more forgiving in terms of what your action can be received as, or how you can perceive your action as selfless in the world. Both valid, just different thoughts, different perspectives. Next slide, please. Jnana yoga is the knowledge of self. It's important to note that jnana is not knowledge for the sake of knowledge. So it's not like, oh, I know this because I know it. It's also not necessarily knowledge of your perception or a teacher's perception, I should say, of scripture or ancient text, but it is knowledge of the divine living and breathing through you. It is the knowledge of the spirit or the sat that is living and breathing through you. So sat is truth. So what truth is living through you? Now, remember, our perception is based on our lived experience, and my lived experience is different than Stephanie's lived experience, is different than Lizzie's lived experience. So everybody's lived experience is going to be a little bit different. And it's not universal truth, but jnana yoga is universal. And universal is that we are all being in experience. And I use the word being because divine being is activating to some people. And, God can be activating, universal consciousness can be activating, but being awareness in which everything is arising, that's definitely something that I've gotten from Richard, from studying with Richard. And it's much more palatable. People can identify with it. They can connect to it. They can relate to it. They can feel it as a felt sense in their body. And that is something that we're trying to get people to do. I don't want these concepts to be so abstract that people can't identify with them in their own lives. Again, to me, that's a very sort of abstract way of looking at it. That makes it feel like it's hard to achieve or hard to attain. Rather, I would like for students or practitioners to be able to anchor their experience in a way that makes sense for them. If they can say, oh yeah, there's this awareness in which all of the fluctuating thoughts and feelings, sensations, emotions come and go, but awareness never changes. That's what Jnana Yoga is saying is the self. That is the self. And if we take it even a step further, Jnana Yoga says that's Atman. That is the essence of the universal divinity. We'll take the next slide, please. Rajas yoga is reserved for, it's yoga reserved for royalty traditionally. It's not so much anymore, but that's how it traditionally was viewed. Rajas yogas include studying scriptures, cleansing practices like kriyas, asanas, seated pranayama or seated asana practices, pranayama, pratyahara, and states of meditation, which are considered Antara yoga, and that may be misspelled. I'm so sorry, I'm dyslexic, so sometimes I miss the spelling. Many people look at the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali as Rajas yoga, and I think that's appropriate. Rajas yoga and Ashtanga yoga are not synonymous, although Ashtanga yoga is, it was designed to be a form of Rajas yoga that a householder could incorporate into their life in a manageable amount of time. So the idea with Ashtanga yoga is that it ticks all of the boxes of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which is a sort of blueprint or a foundation of Rajas yoga, and that it can be then applied to our quest for connection through that type of yoga. And I'll finish this next slide and then I'll check in with the chat because I know there are a couple questions down there. Laya yoga is traditional kundalini. It is not the kundalini that is practiced under the lineage of Yogi Bhajan, which is a modern adaptation. I am not a kundalini teacher under that lineage. I have not been trained under Yogi Bhajan. True Laya yoga is secreted. It's only available to those initiated into a cult of practitioners who still adhere to the ancient techniques. It's my understanding, based on, like I said, studying through with Richard, studying with Leslie Kaminoff, people who have studied directly with Desikachar and Krishnamacharya, that in order to study Laya yoga in its traditional sense, the way it was studied thousands and thousands of years ago, you would need to be immersed in and when I say cult, I don't mean cults the way that we would think of cults. I'm meaning like a group or a sangha of practitioners that have been studying and practicing this for generations and really had that tradition ingrained in their ancestry. Essentially, the techniques are designed to rise Kundalini energy. Kundalini energy is the potential energy that must be married with Adi Shakti. Adi Shakti is the universal energy that is available to all of us. But ultimately, this Kundalini energy is sort of brought to Adi Shakti through practices and states of consciousness that are achieved through meditation. According to Krishnamacharya, Agni is also a large part of this practice. It draws the Kundalini energy up as it is required through eradicating impurities and limiting beliefs, blocking the flow of energy, helping it to meet Adi Shakti. I just actually got back from a cadaver lab with Leslie Kaminoff. Leslie is one of my teachers, and he and I do a lot. We're actually doing another cadaver lab next year together, and he's working with me to write the foreword for my book on Vinyasa. And one of the things that he always talks about when he talks about Kundalini energy and Krishnamacharya and Desikachar is their perspective of Kundalini energy is so different than the perspectives that you see out there in books or on the internet, etc. And it goes back to the fact that Krishnamacharya was a Brahmin, and his lineage in the Brahmin lineage brings him straight back to Laya yoga. And this is the traditional Kundalini yoga. And so let's pause for a moment. I'm just going to pop in the chat and take some questions, see if there are any questions in the chat that I can answer. So Ronnie says, if you teach for donations and give it all away to local charities, that helps the homeless populations. Is that karma yoga? Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that anytime that you are giving yourself, giving your time, your energy, your intellect, your emotional energy, any energy at all, selflessly, you are practicing karma yoga. Teaching is always a gift. Whether we're teaching donation-based yoga or whether we're teaching at a studio, what we have to remember is teaching is always about the student. It's never about the teacher. It doesn't matter how many people come to our class, how much money is made, or what have you. It really is about holding space for the student to come back to themselves. And if we're doing that, regardless of money, it's karma yoga. So, coming into it with the right frame of mind, I think is step one. But it sounds like, yes, that would be karma yoga. Yes, we will be able to provide the slides. And yes, I agree, Caitlin, that it's not a dichotomy. I think that, and Caitlin's comment is about gender not being a dichotomy, and absolutely my daughter would agree, and she'd be right there with you. I wanted to note that because for a long time, up until maybe about the last 50 years, it was looked at as a polarity, right? So up until maybe 50 years ago, especially in the United States, we do see other cultures, and India is one of them, where transgender and gender fluidity has been accepted as a metaphysical gift, actually, in yoga and in the metaphysical spiritual world for centuries. It's actually a quality that can be sought after depending on what philosophy you're sort of in line with or in lineage with. But I think that traditionally, if I was talking to my grandparents or my great-grandparents, they would tell us that it is a dichotomy. It's not anymore. I agree with you 100%. But if we're looking at the history and we're sort of benchmarking against where we've been, where we're going, and what we have for the future, we're sort of eradicating that, and we're forging a new path, and we're looking at the spectrum. It's not a polarity. It is a spectrum. There are many different bus stops on this line. And I agree with you, and I want to acknowledge your comment. And like I said, yeah, Alexis would agree with you too. Beautiful. So where I live in Santa Cruz, there are a lot of tantric workshops, but they were hypersexualized, and I felt like it was a bunch of swingers. So I never really understood what Tantra Yoga is. Do you know how this branch came about? Yes. So that's the left-hand path. What I'm teaching on today is the right-hand path. And essentially, if we had a little bit more time, I would have taken you back into like the different sort of sects of like how this all came about. And we would talk a little bit about, the Brahmins. We might talk a little bit about the aesthetics. We would talk a little bit about the different cultural ties. And ultimately what happened was, and Anna Pilar and I are teaching on this right now, is that we had a lot of people, you can think of them sort of as traditionalists, that were really trying to get closer to God. How can we get closer to God? How can we get closer to universal consciousness? How can we recognize that we are an embodiment of Sat Chit Ananda? And so they were doing all these practices, purification practices, et cetera, et cetera. And as they were doing these practices, there were some people that were like, but hey, wait a second, what about that part of me that is base? What about that part of me that is primal? What about that part of me that's an animal? Well, yeah, there is that part of us that is base and primal and animalistic. And so that left-hand path came about to say, hey, you can't have the right without the left. Does that make sense, Linda? And so what's happened, especially in America, is we've latched onto that. And I won't say especially in America, I am American, so I don't really know, my perspective is that Americans have latched onto it more than other places, but I have some European students that also have talked to me about it's very prevalent in Europe as well. So it's harder to find the history and the lineage of traditional right-hand tantric yoga unless you go deeper and you dive a little deeper and you get into Kashmir Shaivism and Advaita Vedanta. There are some other nuances too that we have to consider. There are Buddhist tantric practices as well. So this whole thing can get very confusing if we don't sort of map it out properly. Today, we're looking at Tantra Yoga through the lens of Hinduism and through the lens of the right-hand path. We're not really looking at the left-hand path. We're really looking at the traditional, original Tantra Yoga as a tapestry of self-realization, or of a tapestry of practices leading to self-realization. But one could say, that the left-hand path also leads me to self-realization. Through my intimacy with my partner, through intimacy even with myself, I can realize the divinity within me, yes? So there's something to be learned from both sides. And again, as a non-dual teacher, I would, sort of like suggest, or maybe even, challenge students to sit with which one they're most attracted to. I'm more attracted to the right-hand side because that's my practice. I am already renunciate. I am renunciate partially because my parents died both my parents died when they were in their 50s. And so I'm in my 40s, and psychologically, my unconscious mind thinks I'm going to die in the next 8 years. And so I've been renunciate for the last, maybe 4 or 5 years. The older I get, the less I care about food, the less I care about sex, the less I care about, entertainment, all of these things, the more I just focus on God. That's really my practice. All I want is to be near and with and in remembering of who I am and who everyone else is. Like, I want to have so much compassion that I can have the same amount of compassion for the murderer as I have for the saint. That's my practice. But that's the practice of a renunciate. It really is. And Nashala is another one of my teachers. She and I have talked about this as well. That's not typical of somebody in their 40s or 50s. Most of the time people in their 40s or 50s are still like, hey, let's have a little fun. And so I do think that there is a place for both. And I think that even in my own practice, it would probably do me some good to lean into the left side a little bit. Lizzie, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. If I didn't get your question, feel free to copy and paste it into the chat. So moving right along, as human beings, we have this longing. At least this is my perception, and I'm definitely open to a dialogue around this. I know that my perception is not universal truth, but we have this longing, a heartfelt desire to be united with one another. And we long to be connected to Creator. We recognize ourselves as created, and we want to be connected to Creator to feel whole and complete. In childhood, we long for these relationships to be satisfied through our relationship with our parents. But as we get older, we look to potential partners to co-create with us in our manifest experience. We essentially become Purusha and Prakriti metaphorically. And this cycle starts all over again. For many of us, we also long for a spiritual connection to the universal creator, which propels us down this spiritual path. We'll go to the next slide. So why is an integrative practice so important? We'll move on. So this is why I think it's so important. And as a yoga therapist, I do blend yoga, like traditional teaching, and yoga therapy quite frequently. And ultimately, my perspective on healing is a little bit unorthodox. And again, I'm writing this book on vinyasa, but it's not what you would think. It's really on vinyasa as a tool for yoga therapy. And part of what we're talking about in this book is healing. And the idea that healing is a journey, I think, is maybe a little bit of a misunderstanding. For example, when you have surgery, when I have surgery, when anyone cuts themselves or we have a physical injury, the body heals itself really quickly. There's not a lot of time required. The cells begin to knit themselves back together. We develop adhesions, which is scar tissue. Scar tissue creates adhesions. These are attachments to make sure that the bond that is created to heal the wound is strong enough to endure stress, appropriate stress that will be inevitably exerted on the body part that has been injured. All right, so if we just take that into consideration, then we might say, okay, well, I've experienced this injury, whether it's physical, intellectual, emotional, or spiritual, I heal from it relatively quickly, but I have adhesions, I have attachments, I have aversions, all of these things, and I have pain. And because of these attachments and because of the pain, I have suffering. Now, this goes way back to Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and Samadhipada, he talks to us about, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. And this is the hook and the anchor that I latch onto, because if we understand that pain is inevitable and then that suffering is optional, then I can sort of identify why I'm suffering. And according to the sutras, suffering is because of attachments. And those attachments are based on the kleshas. And the kleshas are my ignorance, or avidya, my ego, or asmiti, or ragas, devesha, attachment and aversion, and then abhidivesha, or the fear of impermanence or the fear of death. So ultimately, that's what keeps me bound and suffering. So now I'm going back to this idea of integration as healing, right? So when we look at our lives through the lens of integration, we see that our experiences have shaped our perception of reality. And in fact, each of us are living in this altered state of reality all the time based on our own perspective. And it's not universal truth, which is fine. That's normal. And although our perspective is valid because it happened to us, right? It's what we've lived through. It's certainly not universal for everyone. And therefore, it can't be applied to everyone as quote unquote truth. When we experience trauma, hurt, pain, or loss, we heal almost instantly, just like our skin would or our flesh, but healing comes with adhesions, attachments, and conditions that, again, are based on our lived experience. When we can integrate our mind and our body on a physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual level, we can align the physical and metaphysical fibers of our being into congruence. This allows our energy to flow unobstructed, and we can manifest our deepest desires. So just like a wound heals within 6 weeks, our emotional and psychological wounds heal relatively quickly. But without integration, these attachments and misunderstandings, the projections and dissonance can cause dis-ease for a lifetime. When this happens, we believe we are broken, but this is a misunderstanding. We are never broken. In fact, we are always whole and complete because we are always embodiments of the divine. We are universal consciousness embodied in this human experience, and therefore we cannot be less than, we can't be incomplete, we can't be lacking or flawed. Everything that we experience, even the most intense dukkha, the most intense suffering, is an effort to our awakening into our natural enlightened state of being. When we awaken into that state of being and we practice and we stay there long enough, we start to come into states of self-realization. The more we're in remembering, the longer we stay there. And that's what Richard Miller says. We're always remembering and we're always forgetting. We're always remembering and we're always forgetting. Integration is remembering more than we forget. Next slide, please. I get all fired up about this and my face gets hot. I'm sort of glad the camera's not on. I'm like all red over here. So Tantra says there are 7 stages of practice. The first stage is purification. And this is super important because think about it. I almost, part of me now wishes I could stop the presentation and sort of like talk to you face to face, but think about it like before we're in practice, right? Before we are in like an actual state of practice, we're just bouncing between Rajas and Tamas. Rajas and Tamas bounce back and forth, right? And there's not a lot of self-regulation. And if you're not familiar with Rajas and Tamas, those are the gunas, right? Rajas is that doing, I'm doing, I'm going, I'm going, I'm going. And Tamas is, oh my God, I can't do another thing. I just can't get off my couch. I'm done, right? And so we bounce back and forth between those 2 energies, right? And the sattva, or that balance, is between the 2 of those. And so when we are out of practice or before we're in practice, that's how it goes. And that bouncing back and forth builds up ama, undigested food in the body. So that buildup of ama is toxic in the body. Now, if we don't address the buildup of ama, from an Ayurvedic perspective, ama will yield disease in the body. That's how disease occurs, is psychological ama precipitates into the body and causes physical ama, which causes disease. That's the Ayurvedic disease process in a very short, condensed version. But so if we the very first stage in Tantra is you have to purify. You have to purify the body, you have to purify the mind, you have to purify the intellect. So there's a purification practice. And we see this through Kriya. We see this through all sorts of different asana and pranayama practices. You might be familiar with Shakt Kriya, like Kapalabhati or Basti or Neti, when you're cleaning your sinuses, or you might do tongue scraping, you might do Abhinyanga. These are all different cleansing processes, a part of your Dinyacharya, to keep you clean and to get the ama out of your body, right? So that's the first step. Then the next step is strengthening. This is where the Hatha Yoga comes in, right? Strengthening the physical, the intellectual, the emotional, and the spiritual. And this is important, but it's not strengthening my will. And this is so important. It is not that I'm going to strengthen my will so that I have more of the I, me, and my. It's actually that I strengthen my own fortitude, that I strengthen my faith, that I strengthen my body, that I strengthen my mind so that I can leverage discernment. Discernment allows me to see my material apart from truth. And when I can see my material apart from truth, I know when school's in session and when I need to go sit down and do my work around my own material, or when I am sitting and resting in universal truth. Once I have done my purification and I've done my strengthening and I've let go of my will, okay? So letting go of the will is letting go of that I, me, my. Then now I can come into the practices that calm and stabilize the body. When I calm and stabilize, and it's not only the body, it's the body and the mind. Sorry, I should have said the body and the mind. I'm using the qualities of the moon, I'm using the qualities of the sun to either calm and stabilize, that's Chandra, or to energize, that's Surya, depending on what I'm doing. And then ultimately, I use Agni to illuminate and absorb and come into that state of self-realization. We'll go to the next slide and I'll show you a couple of little nuances here. When we're in that Chandra state, so we've already done the purification of the body and mind, we've done the strengthening of the body and the mind. Now we're in the Chandra state where we're sort of calming the mind. Think about it like this. If I'm upset about something, or if I'm in my own head, I can't think clearly, I can't use discernment. So I have to calm my mind down. How do I do that? I do it with practices like Lungana practices. What is Lungana? It is a reducing practice. It reduces the energy or the chitta vritti that is in my field of awareness, right? So a Lungana practice, or a Chandra practice, or like a Chandra Nadi Shodhana, for example, like a Chandra alternate nostril breathing. Those are types of practices that are going to reduce the amount of mental energy and provide mental clarity and ease, if that makes sense. Then after I have mental clarity and ease, I want to create focus. How do I create focus? I leverage Surya. Now I'm going to tone my nervous system to be more like the cheetah and less like the gazelle. So I'm going to activate my sympathetic nervous system through Brahmana practices. Brahmana practices activate the sympathetic nervous system, but in a controlled environment with appropriate stress, I can then tone my sympathetic nervous system to respond rather than react. When I respond rather than react, I am leveraging the superpower of discernment, and I am changing my patterns. I'm no longer reacting to things like I normally would in my samskaras, but I'm actually breaking free of those samskaras. I'm applying tapas, which is one of our niyamas, which burns through karmas. When we apply tapas, svadhyaya, and Ishvara pranadamam, we are burning through karma. And then that is that Agni, that fire that unlocks spirit and helps us to rest in pure awareness that allows us to become absorbed in the illumination of the truth of who we really are. So ultimately, this is the practice of Tantra Yoga. How did I nail it right on the nose? We are right at 1 o'clock. I think we're just about done with the presentation, but I'd love to open it up for some questions if anybody has questions about this presentation and this perspective of Tantra Yoga.
This was amazing. Michelle, the passion I could feel, I think a lot of our attendees also felt that way as well. We love it. We had a question from Caitlin Brown. It's in the question feature. It says, what is IN/RET under Surya? Excuse me if I'm saying that wrong. Or in ret under Surya.
Is it in the other? Oh, I think it's in the slide right above. I think it's on 17, slide 17. Oh, it's the retention. So,
oh, right.
Oh, so go back for me. It's good at 18 for me. Well, no, it's here. It's here, right here. It's here, right here. So expansion and either one. So and 5 and 6 on right there. If you look right there on the Surya sun practices, it's talking about higher perception, and then 6 is expansion, intensifying, energize. And inhale, retain. That's what that is. So remember, the breath has 4 parts. When we're looking at it through the lens of yoga, we have 4 parts to the breath. Inhale, retain. Exhale, suspend. Now, don't forget, if you're working with pregnant mamas, we don't suspend, we only retain, because we don't want to deprive them of oxygen, okay? So inhale, retain the breath, hold it in. Exhale, suspend the breath, hold it out. And that's what that's talking about. So when I'm trying to build energy, I inhale and I retain. Now, another thing to note, and not everybody's familiar with this, it sort of depends on your lineage. I'm trained in yoga therapy, so all of our trainings include it, but I don't know if it's unique to us or not. but we teach you Brahmana and Lungana. Brahmana is the expansion. It's an expansive practice. It increases energy. Most vinyasa practices are going to be a Brahmana practice. And the way you activate Brahmana is you inhale on spinal extension, you exhale on spinal flexion. Lungana practices are the opposite. You inhale on spinal flexion, you exhale on spinal extension. So think about cat-cow. Imagine you're in cat-cow, you're in a tabletop. Inhale cow, exhale cat. So this is Brahmana, right? Inhale spinal extension, exhale spinal flexion. Excellent. That's going to make you feel like you've got a ton of energy at the end of that class. You also, in vinyasa, remember, you inhale away from the earth, you exhale towards the earth. You're inhaling every time you extend the spine. You exhale every time you flex the spine, okay? So when you switch that, that reduces your energy. That's a Chandra, like a Lungana practice. And so that would be a tabletop. And I would go inhale cat, I'm inhaling on flexion, exhale cow, inhale cat, exhale cow. So if I was doing that in a vinyasa, it would be inhale towards the earth, exhale away from the earth. Does that make sense?
Yes, Caitlin said yes. Before, since we've already gone over time, just wanted to let everyone know, this will be sent, so the slides and the recording of this webinar will be sent to you via email tomorrow from lizzie@beyogi.com. So definitely check that out. Michelle, if you want to stay for another 5 minutes to answer some more questions, we'd love it, but we completely understand if you have other time requirements. So just let us know. But we can answer a few more, or we can, part ways, and I can send you some of these questions for you to potentially answer.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I can, help facilitate here. So a few questions that came in. What are some readings / books you would recommend to delve a little bit deeper?
Absolutely. So always, always, always primary source. Even though I'm on my way to, would you grab me Jahari, please? Even though I'm about to write a book, I'm like what, 4th source, 17th source down the line after thousands of years of this stuff. So always go back to the primary source. The Vedas, I would go to the Vedas. You really can't understand Tantra unless you have a little bit of an understanding of the Vedas and why these concepts and Agni and the gods and Surya and Chandra are so important to the yogis. And that really comes directly from the Vedas. Another one, and I'm going to type this one in the chat. This is like the sauce. If you're interested in any really good literature, his name is Harish Jahari, and he does, did I just send that to you, Lizzie? I'm so sorry. I'm going to send that to
everybody. I got it. Don't worry. You keep going.
So Harish Jahari, he has written Tools for Tantra and then Chakras, Energy Centers for Transformation. Both of those books are fantastic. The Upanishads, as always, the Bhagavad Gita is another one that I highly recommend. And then there's a little tiny book on Kashmir Shaivism that, oh yes, here it is. This one, it is, I'm going to type this one in the chat too. This one might be harder to get. If anybody ever wants this, you can email me directly, and I will email Richard if I need to, because I got this from Richard. That's the author, and it's Kashmir Shaivism. I can't spell to save my life. Okay, there we go. Excellent. So those are the ones that I would start with. You can also look through the Hatha Pradipakita is a good one to have on hand. And then I would also say there's another one, Systematic Tools for Tantra, Yoga, and Kriya is another one that is good.
Great.
And one final word, Lizzie, just before, you know, with Tantra Yoga, if you go to Amazon and you just put Tantra in there, you are going to get a lot of the left-hand stuff. It's going to be a lot about sex and, you know, like tantric sex and all of that stuff. Like I said, there's a place for that. But if you're looking for the traditional right-hand path, these books and these authors are going to give you what you're looking for.
Awesome. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michelle. The last question, you can 30 seconds or less. But Megan asks, I'm understanding the concept, but wondering what would your typical Tantra yoga class structure look like? I don't know if you can answer that within 30 seconds, but
Yeah,
if you want to take a shot.
Yeah, basically, I mean, like, it doesn't look much different in an actual class setting. When we teach teachers to be tantric yoga teachers, we teach them a lot more about like the one-on-one relationship. So, and that's something that I would love for us as an industry to do a better job at cultivating. You know, the personal trainers have really done a great job on educating clients and potential clients about why it's important to do one-on-ones with personal trainers. In yoga, we haven't done the best job about teaching people that a one-on-one relationship with a teacher is important, right? And when you're working one-on-one with a teacher, a yoga teacher, having a teacher trained in Tantra really is beneficial because they are trained in all of the different practices and in an integrative way that helps people to really pick and choose the practices that are going to be most applicable for their life. So the actual class wouldn't look much different, right? The one-on-one scenario would look a lot different because it's so tailored for the individual practitioner.
Awesome. Well, that wraps it up. And thank you so much, Michelle, for spending the hour with us and really getting deep into it. We are so happy. And everyone, thank you for sticking around and joining us. We'll send the recording and all of this information to you guys via email. And thank you, Michelle, again for taking the time to speak to us. We'll talk soon.
Thanks for having me, everyone. Have a great day.
Alrighty. Bye-bye.
Bye.